France is on the verge of a gradually accelerating economy, says Thomas Torgerson, Senior Vice President, DBRS. According to the World Bank's Doing Business Index, it is easier to start a new company in Kazakhstan and Ukraine than it is in France. What are the factors you would say this is due to?
I think, first of all, I just want to observe that Ukraine and Kazakhstan have undertaken massive reforms in the past few years to move up in the rankings. Ukraine started at 70 a few years ago. Now it's down to about 30. Kazakhstan has moved from 50 to 20, while France has slipped slightly in those rankings. So I think it's important to keep in consideration the rankings themselves suggest that France has slipped relative to other countries. But when you start to look under the hood, you do see that they've actually made a number of improvements themselves in an effort to reduce some of the regulatory barriers to business. So, for example, the time required to start a business in France has actually declined from 6.5 days to 4 days just in the past 2 years. And if you look at trading across borders, which is another component of the index, France is actually ranked number 1 in the world, down from 11 just 2 years ago. So, I think the French authorities have recognized that there are some challenges that do limit small businesses in particular, and I think they are serious about tackling a number of those issues. We've looked at the scope of the reforms across the last couple of years, and a lot of them affect very small sectors, but they are nonetheless meaningful. So even down to the notary regulations that they have tried to reduce over the past few years. So it's difficult to measure those from a macro standpoint of the entire economy, but I do think they are making a number of important changes in an effort to address some of those regulatory barriers.
Imports currently override exports, standing at 40.747 million, while exports stand at 36.379 million as of March 2016. This imbalance in the economy can clearly be seen, and how can France overcome it when over 10% of its workforce is unemployed?
When you look at goods exports, the figures you refer to are exclusively on the goods side. If you include services, France's trade balance is actually more modest and has seen a significant improvement over the last few years. When you think about the goods and services, building an aircraft that you sell to another country is a goods export. If you repair that same aircraft, that's a service export. Selling food in a grocery store is a goods export. Selling food in a restaurant to a tourist, for example, is a service export. So where France has, we prefer to take kind of a broader look at the way countries trade, which incorporates that service sector, which has been a traditional strength of France. Again, incorporating those services, overall trade balance has actually been broadly stable over the last 2 years, but it has gradually improved since about 2011. That doesn't mean it's not related to the unemployment problem, and certainly I do believe France can do more to increase competition, reduce impediments to the growth of small businesses, and encourage more dynamism in the business sector to ultimately expand the number of exporting firms. I believe a number of those measures would be important and could help France to rectify some of that imbalance. But I would just emphasize the imbalance is not all that significant in our view. And part of what's driven that imbalance over the past few years as well is just the cost of energy, which has come down. It's difficult to pin it all to one single factor. I do think we see some resilience in their exports, especially in that services sector.
In the long term, how does France rectify the stagnation currently in its trade economy?
Service exports in 2015 were 217 billion euros, which is up 25 billion over the past 2 years. Goods exports were 460 billion, which is over the past 2 years. So the export sector, again, is seeing an expansion. This was offset, of course, by an expansion in service imports, which was roughly 40 billion over the past 2 years. So that, again, that contributes to kind of the stable overall balance. But we do see some dynamism in that export sector.
France has run a trade deficit since May 2004, and it doesn't look likely to move anytime soon. How is the appreciation of the euro a contributing factor towards this?
Once again, I've noted, when you incorporate services, the deficit does not look as bad. And again, even the recent trends, given the contribution from lower energy prices, and again, some of the export growth that they have seen, the trade deficit has actually improved. The euro, of course, went through a substantial depreciation and more recently has begun to appreciate again. I think France benefited from that depreciation and, of course, may incur a bit of a setback as the euro appreciates again. The economy itself, I think, is finally undergoing a more resilient recovery. The last quarter GDP data, I think, was quite positive, and we think France is in a gradually accelerating recovery. It's not a particularly dynamic economy given the large size of the public sector and the existence of the automatic stabilizers and the way those function in France. We do think the recovery itself appears to be quite solid. Ultimately, that's what drove our recent decision to maintain France's AAA rating. This is an economy that's very large, very diverse. Ultimately, I think the euro, global energy prices, global growth do have an impact on France, but the domestic economy as well is very large, and domestic demand growth has actually picked up in recent quarters, and we think that's quite resilient.
That's all from Thomas Torgerson, the Senior Vice President of DBRS. Stay with Dukascopy TV for all your updates with everything FX. I'm Lucy Porferman. Bye for now.